Welcome, everyone, to our deep dive into the dating debate of First Clement. We're exploring whether this early Christian letter truly hails from 96 AD, or if its origins are quite a bit later.
I'm eager to jump in. So, we're questioning the traditional dating here, right?
Exactly. Traditionally, scholars have pegged First Clement around the late 1st century, roughly 96 AD, during Emperor Domitian's reign. They base this on a mention of sudden and repeated misfortunes that many interpret as linked to Christian persecutions.
Right, I've read that reference suggests those misfortunes could be connected to Domitian's vibe at the time.
Yes, and what's interesting is that prominent scholars like Bart Ehrman, J.B. Lightfoot, and Larry Hurtado have all supported this view, relying heavily on the letter's internal context and the early church tradition of Clement as Rome's bishop.
Yep, that aligns with what I've seen. But if that's the traditional view, where does the challenge come in?
Well, here's where things get edgy. Some recent skeptical scholars argue that nothing in the text directly names Domitian, which means that sudden misfortune could be like almost any ecclesiastical or even political event.
So you're saying it might not be a nod to any specific persecution, but rather a general reference?
Exactly. And critics like Thomas L. Brodie and Robert Price point out that the theological content of First Clement is surprisingly advanced for a first century document. They suggest it might rely on later New Testament texts, almost resembling second century church politics.
That's an interesting shift in perspective. Wait, so are we essentially looking at a document that might have been written much later than traditionally accepted?
Precisely. Richard Carrier, for example, goes further by proposing that First Clement could be pseudepigraphical, written under Clement's name to build authority, but penned in the second century.
Right, that really shakes up the idea of early church unity. And then there's Markus Vinzent, who argues that the text might have been composed well after Marcion's time, suggesting a mid-2nd century dating, correct?
Yes, that's exactly it. It's like the text content seems to reflect a more developed ecclesiology than what you'd expect from an early Christian document.
Understandable point.
Now, one of the big puzzles is the theological tone itself. This letter is deeply focused on church order, submission to authority, and the obedience to bishops. These themes hint at concerns that seem far more developed than those seen in, say, the Pauline epistles.
So these themes could be seen as a sort of later invention to bolster church hierarchy?
Exactly. It's like the text is being used to retroactively justify a structured church hierarchy. There's even an irony here. If Clement truly wrote this in 96 AD, why isn't there any mention of Paul or Peter in Rome, especially considering the known historical accounts?
Right, that silence does feel like a glaring omission.
Yeah, it's suspicious. Another detail is that the letter quotes various New Testament texts, yet not always with proper attribution. This could hint that the NT canon was already taking shape, or maybe even complete, which again seems early for the 1st century.
So in essence, the letter's internal textual clues leave us with more questions than answers about its actual date?
Exactly. And there's that critical observation by Carrier about Eusebius. He had a vested interest in preserving a neat lineage from Peter to later bishops, making Clement a convenient figure in his chronological reconstruction.
That potential agenda definitely muddies the waters. I can see how relying on Eusebius's testimony might be problematic. But aren't there still some strong reasons to trust the traditional 96 AD date?
Yes, the traditional view does rest on early patristic references and internal historical hints, like the mention of misfortunes. However, the absence of concrete dating evidence in the letter itself and the advanced theological themes create a serious case for a later date.
Definitely a point to consider.
Now, while discussing these issues, some might say, but isn't it normal for texts to mature in their theological outlook as time passes? And that's a fair question.
I get that argument. But wouldn't that then blur the line between original composition and later editorial influence?
Right. And that's the heart of the critique. If the letter is indeed a later composition, it may have been composed specifically to settle, or even consolidate internal church disputes and reinforce Roman authority. And you know what's also intriguing? The very silence regarding key early Christian figures. If Clement truly was influencing or corroborating early church structures in the mid-90s. Why are there no references to Paul interacting with the church in Corinth or Peter's martyrdom under Nero in Rome?
It's almost like the letter selectively presents its historical narrative to serve a particular agenda.
Precisely. And that selective narrative, including the heavy emphasis on church order and obedience, seems tailored for a context where church hierarchy was a burning issue, likely a later time period.
It's like designing a script to support a current political stance.
Now, while arguing this, I have to say one could respectfully challenge the skeptics by arguing that internal consistency in the text might indeed support an earlier date. The language and style do have a first-century flavor.
That's a fair counterpoint. But then, isn't it possible that language and style can be deliberately archaic when trying to invoke authority?
Sure, it's like a deliberate throwback, you could say, to borrow styles from a revered past to legitimize current practice.
Exactly.
So, to sum up, when we ask ourselves, when was 1 Clement actually written? We're left with an uncomfortable uncertainty. The traditional dating points to the 1st century backed by early church attestation, while the skeptical view raises crucial doubts about internal references, theological development, and historical silence.
Right on, that duality is really at the center of the debate. And this debate isn't just academic. Its implications stretch far into how we understand the evolution of early church structure and authority, isn't it?
Absolutely. If 1 Clement turns out to be a later work, it challenges the notion that the early church had a unified ecclesiastical structure as early as traditionally believed.
That really turns conventional wisdom on its head.
And there's more. This debate invites us to re-examine other early Christian texts with a similar critical eye. It's sort of like pulling apart the seams of a historical quilt to see what's really underneath.
Yes, and it reminds us that our understanding of early history is often more complex and layered than it first appears. It makes me wonder, how do we even strike a balance between relying on traditional attributions and embracing a more critical analysis?
That's a great question. I think it's about recognizing that tradition provides a valuable starting point, but then we have to let the evidence speak for itself, even if that evidence is frustratingly ambiguous.
Totally agree.
And as much as we may want clear-cut answers, the historical record sometimes leaves us with more questions. In the case of 1 Clement, the lack of specific internal dates forces us to confront these uncertainties head-on.
Absolutely. It's like a mystery that doesn't resolve neatly. So what is our takeaway here? That the dating of 1 Clement is still very much an open debate?
Exactly. Until we uncover new evidence or reinterpret the existing clues in a compelling way, the question remains, was it really written in the late 1st century, or is it a product of later, calculated consolidation of Christian authority?
It's definitely food for thought.
And that's what keeps the study of early Christian texts so exciting. Every answer seems to open up a new field of inquiry, challenging us to rethink what we consider established history.
Right, and it's a reminder of how dynamic historical scholarship can be. This discussion really highlights how even ancient texts can spark controversies that affect our understanding of history and identity.
Yes, it's like peeling back layers of tradition and authority, revealing a more contested and complex past than simply what's been handed down. And as we continue to explore these debates, it reinforces the need for a critical eye and an open mind to the evidence. While tradition offers one narrative, skepticism pushes us to probe deeper into the when and how behind these influential texts.
Well said. It seems that in the end, the dating of 1 Clement remains ambiguous, challenging us to keep questioning and never take traditional claims at face value.
Exactly. And that, folks, is what makes studying early Christianity so endlessly fascinating. Thanks for joining this discussion, and until next time, keep questioning.